The woman hammering on my front door at dawn wasn't delivering packages. She clutched her smartphone with emergency services pre-dialed, shrieking that my spouse was an illegal occupant trespassing in our own residence. There I stood in my morning robe, steam rising from my coffee cup in the chilly air, facing this furious individual, literally trembling with anger, because my partner dared to leave her Toyota in our own driveway overnight. This association president, we'll call her Margaret, demanded that officers arrest Sophia for the offense of residing where she legitimately belonged. Her piercing voice bounced off the frost-covered walkways while residents peered through their blinds at the dawn spectacle. Here's the reality about community bullies. They inevitably target the wrong person eventually, because 30 minutes after Margaret placed that emergency call, she'd be clutching entirely different documents bearing her signature. Foreclosure notices. What would you do if your homeowners association leader attempted to remove your partner from your shared property? Leave a comment sharing your location and whether your area has such individuals. Let me explain how we reached this absurd situation. I'm David, age 47, employed as a facility maintenance coordinator. The type of person who settles accounts ahead of schedule, maintains an immaculate yard, and avoids unnecessary conflicts. 4 years back, I purchased this residence in Meadowbrook Estates for $310,000, a respectable working-class community with an association charging $195 monthly for groundskeeping and amenity maintenance. Nothing luxurious, but tidy and peaceful. 8 months ago, I wed Sophia, a 36-year-old emergency room physician who preserves lives professionally. This past weekend marked her official relocation day. Saturday morning, she was transferring boxes from her Toyota Camry when complications arose, appearing in formal attire and wielding a clipboard. Enter Margaret Richardson, 56 years old, association president for 5 consecutive years, and someone who measures lawn heights with precise instruments. She departed from the municipal planning department with excessive free time and insufficient purpose, residing in the largest corner property with flower arrangements so pristine they appeared artificial. Within 15 minutes of Sophia parking in our driveway, Margaret was advancing like she was addressing a crisis. "Excuse me," Margaret declared, pen positioned like artillery. "We maintain overnight parking restrictions here." She glared at Sophia's Toyota as if it were a mobile disaster. "Multiple vehicles per residence requires committee authorization. That professional equipment violates our residential-only regulations." Professional equipment. Sophia's medical kit, stethoscope, and monitoring devices were visible through the back window, the instruments she uses to maintain cardiac function at the medical center. Yet Margaret was already documenting a $175 penalty, her polished nails tapping against the clipboard like miniature hammers. I emerged with our wedding documentation and ownership papers, both clearly displaying Sophia's name beside mine. "She's my spouse, Margaret. She resides here now." The morning atmosphere carried the fragrance of fresh mulch from Margaret's obsessively maintained garden, areas as I attempted to maintain composure. Margaret barely examined the paperwork. Irrelevant. Regulations remain consistent. She attached the citation to Sophia's windshield with the satisfaction of someone who had just conquered territory. Certain individuals believe regulations don't apply to them. That's when I noticed Sophia's expression. Wounded, bewildered, as if she'd been struck. This individual was treating my spouse like a lawbreaker for the crime of existing at her own residence. Sophia held a container of medical textbooks, still wearing her hospital identification from yesterday's shift, having saved critically ill patients. This clipboard-carrying dictator was making her feel unwelcome in her own driveway. Margaret wasn't finished. "I'll be submitting an official grievance with county code enforcement regarding this boarding establishment situation," she announced loudly enough for residents to hear. "I'm deeply concerned about all this suspicious medical equipment." She referenced Sophia's equipment as if she operated an illegal laboratory, instead of carrying tools that literally restart hearts. The sound of Margaret's shoes clicking against pavement echoed through the morning quiet as she marched back to her stronghold, leaving Sophia standing there holding her container, appearing as if she wanted to vanish. 3 residents watched from their windows, curtains quickly closing when I looked their direction. That evening, Sophia sat at our kitchen table, still wearing her scrubs after a 14-hour shift in emergency medicine. "Perhaps we should simply pay the fine," she said quietly, exhaustion heavy in her voice. "I don't want to create complications," watching this incredible woman who battles mortality daily to preserve other people's families, worried about creating complications because some authority-drunk retiree decided she didn't belong here. I reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers still carried the faint scent of medical antiseptic, the aroma of someone who spends days healing others. "We're not paying that citation," I told her, "and we're certainly not letting her drive us from our own home." That night, lying in bed listening to the distant sound of traffic, I made a decision. Margaret Richardson had just initiated a conflict with the wrong family. 3 days later, I was enjoying my morning coffee when someone knocked at the door. Not Margaret this time. A gentleman in a county uniform held an official clipboard, the metal edge gleaming in the morning sunlight. "Code enforcement," he said, looking embarrassed. "Received a complaint about illegal boarding house operations at this address." I invited him inside, showed him around our perfectly normal home. 2 bedrooms, 1 couple, 0 boarders. He took notes, asked several questions, then shook his head. "Someone filed a complaint claiming you're operating an unlicensed medical facility." He glanced at Sophia's small work bag by the entrance. The familiar scent of medical antiseptic still clinging to the leather. "That's your spouse's nursing equipment, correct?" When I nodded, he sighed. "Whoever called this in wasted everyone's time. You folks have a pleasant day." But Margaret was just beginning. That afternoon, Sophia returned from her shift looking devastated. "Someone contacted the hospital," she told me, her voice barely audible. "They claimed I was using medical equipment for unauthorized purposes and questioned my professional conduct." The hospital administration dismissed it. Sophia was one of their finest physicians, but the fact that someone attempted to sabotage her career made my hands tremble with rage. Then the anonymous messages started appearing. Tuesday morning, there was a folded paper under our windshield wiper. "Keep our community family appropriate." Wednesday, another tucked in our mailbox. "Certain people don't belong here." The messages were printed in block letters like threatening notes, but I recognized the expensive cream-colored stationery from Margaret's formal association communications. Thursday brought the final provocation. Sophia walked outside to her car and stopped abruptly. Someone had scratched a long mark down the passenger side, the metal gleaming raw through the blue paint like an angry wound. She stood there staring at the damage, her shoulders sagging with defeat, and something inside me snapped. That evening, I did what I should have done initially. I actually read our association bylaws, all 53 pages of mind-numbing legal text, sitting at my kitchen table with a highlighter and growing anger. My father always told me, "Son, when someone's playing games with rules, learn the rules better than they do." Turns out Dad was correct, because Margaret had been playing fast and loose with those very same rules. First violation, her fence. The bylaws clearly state maximum height of 6 feet. Margaret's backyard fence measured 6 feet 10 inches. I verified with a tape measure like she taught me. The cold metal reminding me of her clipboard clicking. Second violation, that gorgeous deck edition she was so proud of. No permit on file with the association, and improvements over $7,500 require committee approval. Her deck cost at least $18,000 based on the composite materials I could see. But here's the beautiful part, something I remembered from a property law class I took years ago when I was considering real estate. Association enforcement must be consistent and equitable. You can't selectively enforce rules against some people while ignoring violations by others. It's written in black and white, probably by some attorney who knew exactly how petty tyrants operate. Friday morning, I filed formal complaints against Margaret with the association committee. I included photographs of her fence violation, documentation of her unpermitted deck, and a detailed timeline of her harassment campaign against Sophia. I also cited the consistent enforcement clause and requested an emergency committee meeting to address these serious violations. Monday evening, the emergency committee meeting convened in the community center. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Margaret arrived with her 3 supporters, expecting to push through some motion against us. Instead, she walked into a room where I sat calmly with a folder full of evidence and a smile that probably looked overly confident. Before we discuss any alleged violations involving my family, I announced when the meeting opened, I'd like to address some actual violations that need immediate attention. I slid copies of my documentation across the table to each committee member. the papers making a satisfying whisper against the artificial wood surface. As you can see, we have some serious consistency issues with enforcement in this community. Margaret's face went through several interesting color changes as the committee members reviewed the photographs of her fence and deck. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "David is just trying to deflect from his own violations by making frivolous complaints." "Are you saying the tape measure is lying?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "Or that the county building permits office is wrong about your deck addition?" The room filled with the uncomfortable silence of people realizing their association president had been caught red-handed. The other committee members, decent people who just wanted to keep the neighborhood nice, started asking Margaret some very pointed questions about when she was planning to address her own violations. Margaret's face was now the color of a ripe tomato as she realized her power play had backfired. Spectacularly. "This meeting is over," she declared, grabbing her papers and marching toward the door. "I don't have to listen to this harassment." "Actually," I called after her, "according to the bylaws, meetings can only be adjourned by majority vote." She stopped in the doorway, her whole body rigid with fury, then stormed out into the parking lot where I could hear her car door slam hard enough to rattle windows. If I thought embarrassing Margaret at the committee meeting would make her retreat, I seriously underestimated the fury of a woman who just lost face before her neighbors. The next morning I was heading to work when I noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street. A guy in a cheap suit sitting behind the wheel with a camera, the morning sunlight reflecting off his telephoto lens like a predator's eye. Sophia called me at lunch, her voice tight with anxiety. "There's someone taking pictures of our house," she whispered. "I saw him through the bedroom window when I got home from my shift." The coffee in my mouth suddenly tasted bitter as I realized Margaret had hired a private investigator to surveil us, probably hoping to find some dark secret that would justify her harassment campaign. The irony was delicious. She was paying someone to prove we were the criminals while she was breaking association rules. But Margaret's arsenal was just getting started. Wednesday afternoon, Sophia's supervisor at the hospital called her into the office. The fluorescent lights humming overhead like angry wasps. Someone filed a formal complaint claiming Sophia was mentally unstable and involved in neighborhood disputes that affect her professional judgment. The supervisor, a no-nonsense woman who'd worked with Sophia for 4 years, actually laughed. "Whoever called this in clearly doesn't know you," she told Sophia, "but I have to document it for HR purposes." The smell of Sophia's stress relief lavender lotion filled our bedroom. That night, as she sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders hunched with exhaustion, "Maybe we should just move," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. "I can't handle someone trying to destroy my career over parking spaces." That's when I realized Margaret's strategy wasn't just harassment. It was total warfare designed to drive us out of the neighborhood entirely. Thursday brought a visit from the city planning office. Another anonymous complaint, this time claiming we were violating residential zoning laws by operating a medical practice from our home. The inspector, a patient man who'd clearly dealt with this nonsense before, took one look at Sophia's work bag and shook his head. "Ma'am, unless you're performing surgery in your living room, carrying medical equipment home from work isn't a zoning violation." That evening, I decided to fight smarter instead of harder. I called a property management attorney I found online, remembering something my brother-in-law mentioned at our wedding. He dealt with a similar association nightmare years ago and learned that documentation was everything. The attorney, Rachel Martinez, specialized in association disputes and had that weary tone of someone who'd seen this movie before. "Here's something most people don't realize," she told me, her voice crackling through my phone speaker as I paced our kitchen. "When association enforcement becomes selective and harassing, it creates legal liability for the organization. I had a case last year where hostile environment harassment laws applied to housing situations, same principle as workplace protection. She suggested I start documenting every interaction with timestamps and witnesses, advice that echoed what Sophia learned during her medical training about protecting yourself with proper records. But then she dropped the real bomb. "You might want to request copies of all association financial records for the past 3 years. As a member, Margaret can't legally deny access, and in my experience, people who abuse power often have something to hide in the books." My construction supervisor always said, when someone won't let you look under the hood, that's when you know the engine's blown. Friday morning, I submitted a formal records request to the association committee, asking for 3 years of budgets, expenditures, and vendor contracts. It was a routine request that any member could make. But when Margaret got the email, she called an emergency meeting to discuss protecting sensitive association information from harassment. The attempted cover-up told me everything I needed to know. Margaret's sudden concern about privacy when it came to public records smelled fishier than a week-old salmon. Meanwhile, the private investigator continued his surveillance, though he was getting sloppy about hiding. Tuesday, he followed Sophia to the grocery store, his engine idling loudly in the parking lot. Wednesday, he was parked outside the hospital when she finished her shift, cigarette smoke drifting from his cracked window. By Thursday, Sophia had enough. She walked straight up to his car, knocked on the window and asked if he'd like her autograph since he seemed so interested in photographing her. The guy's face turned red as a stop sign as he drove away, probably realizing that stalking an emergency room physician doesn't exactly scream criminal mastermind. The neighborhood watch meetings Margaret organized drew exactly 4 people, including herself. Tom Garcia, my next-door neighbor who'd lived here for 18 years, showed up and later told me the whole thing was just Margaret complaining about you folks for an hour. Tom was a retired accountant with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She spent more time talking about your spouse's car than actual neighborhood security, he said, the disgust clear in his voice. But here's where Margaret made her biggest mistake. Friday evening, she sent an email to all residents announcing an emergency assessment of $950 per household for enhanced security measures necessitated by recent incidents. The email specifically mentioned costs associated with protecting our community from disruptive elements and demanded payment within 30 days or face property liens. That night, my phone started ringing off the hook, the sound echoing through our house like a dinner bell. Neighbors who'd stayed quiet through all the harassment were suddenly very interested in talking. Turns out nobody likes surprise bills, especially ones that smell like retaliation. Margaret just made this personal for everyone. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes you want to drink coffee on the porch and watch the world wake up. Instead, I was dealing with Margaret banging on my door at 6 a.m., like she was serving a warrant. Her phone already showing the emergency screen, finger hovering over the call button like she was about to launch a nuclear missile. "There's an illegal trespasser in this house," she shrieked, loud enough to wake half the neighborhood. The morning frost crunched under her feet as she paced our front step like a caged animal, her breath forming angry clouds in the cold air. "I'm calling the police right now unless this person leaves immediately." She was pointing at Sophia, who was standing behind me in her medical scrubs, still holding her hospital ID badge from yesterday's shift, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else on earth. I took a deep breath, tasting the cold morning air mixed with the lingering scent of Sophia's coffee. "Margaret, this is my spouse. She lives here. We've shown you the marriage certificate and property deed." But trying to reason with Margaret at this point was like trying to convince a tornado to change direction. She was already committed to destruction. "I don't care what fake papers you have," she snapped, her voice echoing off the frost-covered sidewalk with the sharp crack of breaking ice. "No one moves in without association approval, and I never approve this person." The way she said "this person" made my blood pressure spike into dangerous territory. Sophia wasn't just my spouse. She was an emergency room physician who saved lives for a living. And this woman was treating her like a common criminal. That's when Officer Rodriguez arrived, probably expecting some domestic violence call based on Margaret's hysterical emergency report. Instead, he found 3 adults standing in a driveway, having the world's most ridiculous argument. I calmly showed him our marriage certificate, property deed, and Sophia's driver's license with our address. The officer's expression shifted from alert to annoyed as he realized he'd been dragged into association nonsense on his Saturday morning. "Ma'am," Rodriguez told Margaret, his patience wearing thin like old carpet, "this is a civil matter, not a criminal one. These people have every right to be here." But Margaret doubled down, demanding Sophia be arrested for trespassing, her voice getting shriller with each word until it sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard. By now, neighbors were emerging from their houses like prairie dogs drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Patterson appeared on her porch in her bathrobe, shaking her head in disgust. Tom Garcia stepped outside with his coffee mug, taking in the spectacle with the weary expression of someone watching a train wreck in slow motion. Even the Johnson kids stopped riding their bikes to stare at the crazy lady yelling at the police officer. "No crime has been committed here," Rodriguez stated firmly, his hand moving toward his radio like he was considering calling for backup against Margaret instead of us. "If you file another false report, ma'am, you could face charges yourself." The threat hung in the morning air like smoke, but Margaret was too far gone to hear it. As the police car pulled away, I watched our neighbors' faces. Most looked embarrassed for us, shooting apologetic glances before disappearing back inside. A few lingered, and I caught sympathetic nods from Tom and Mrs. Patterson. But the damage was done. Margaret had now publicly humiliated Sophia in front of the entire neighborhood, turning our morning into a circus with Sophia as the unwilling main act. That weekend, I spent Saturday and Sunday diving deep into our association documents. The papers spread across our kitchen table like a crime scene investigation. Sophia helped organize everything, her medical training proving useful for creating systematic documentation. The smell of fresh printer ink filled our dining room as we copied and categorized 3 years of financial records that Margaret finally had to release after the committee overruled her. Objections, that's when we found it. Buried in the mundane expense reports like a needle in a haystack. Every landscaping contract for the past 2 years went to Richardson Grounds LLC, a company that happened to share Margaret's last name and listed her husband as the registered agent. The payments totaled $52,000 for emergency landscaping, services that our neighborhood definitely didn't receive. I remembered my uncle who worked in city contracting for 25 years, always saying over holiday dinners, "Follow the money, nephew." When someone's acting crazy about power, they're usually protecting their wallet. No competitive bidding. No committee approval for contracts over $7,500, which association bylaws specifically required. No business license or insurance on file. Just Margaret writing checks from the community fund directly to her family business for work that either wasn't done or was massively overpriced. The math was simple. Each household had been overcharged roughly $450 per year to fund Margaret's personal landscaping company. But here's the beautiful part. Sophia noticed something I missed. The dates of the largest payments coincided perfectly with Margaret's most aggressive enforcement actions against other residents. Every time someone challenged her authority, mysterious emergency landscaping bills appeared within weeks. It wasn't just corruption, it was retaliation funding, paid for by the very people she was harassing. Sunday evening, I called Attorney Martinez back. "You're going to want to see this," I told her. The financial documents spread before me like evidence of a crime. "And you might want to clear your calendar. This just became a lot bigger than association harassment." Sophia squeezed my shoulder as I hung up the phone, her touch still carrying that faint scent of medical antiseptic that meant she'd been saving lives while Margaret was stealing money. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," I told her, "we show the neighborhood exactly who they've been paying to protect them." Monday morning, I was sitting in Attorney Martinez's office, watching her review our evidence with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining x-rays. The smell of leather-bound law books mingled with fresh coffee as she spread the financial documents across her mahogany desk, her pen scratching notes in the margins like she was uncovering buried treasure. "This is textbook self-dealing," she said finally, leaning back in her chair with a low whistle that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. "But it's worse than I thought." She pulled out a red folder from her filing cabinet, the metal drawer sliding shut with a satisfying click. "Most committee members try to hide their corruption. Margaret's been brazenly stealing from your community in broad daylight." She walked me through the legal framework, and suddenly I was remembering my business law professor from community college 25 years ago, explaining how corporate directors have a fiduciary duty to shareholders. When association committee members award contracts to themselves or family members without disclosure, competitive bidding and committee approval, they violate that same sacred trust. It wasn't just unethical. It was criminal fraud that destroyed any corporate protection they might claim. "Here's what makes this case special," Martinez continued, the afternoon sunlight streaming through her office window, creating shadows that danced across the evidence. "Your association bylaws require committee approval for any expenditure over $7,500. Margaret, authorized $52,000 in payments to her husband's company without a single recorded vote. That's not oversight, that's intentional theft. But the smoking gun wasn't just the money. It was the vindictive pattern Sophia spotted. Martinez showed me how the largest payments to Richardson Grounds LLC coincided perfectly with resident complaints against Margaret. Someone questions her authority in March. Boom. $9,500 emergency tree removal in April. A resident challenges an association fine in August. Suddenly, there's $14,000 in urgent sprinkler repairs in September, paid to guess who? She's been funding her revenge campaigns with community money, Martinez explained, her voice carrying the righteous anger of someone who'd seen too many bullies abuse power. Every time someone stood up to her, she punished the entire neighborhood by stealing more from the common fund. It's like a medieval queen taxing her subjects to pay for soldiers to keep them in line. The legal implications hit like a freight train. Margaret faced potential criminal charges for theft, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The association's insurance wouldn't cover intentional criminal acts, making her personally liable for every stolen penny plus interest and legal fees. But here's the delicious irony: the false police reports and harassment campaign she'd been running against Sophia create additional criminal exposure for witness intimidation and filing false instruments. Conservative estimate, Martinez said, her calculator clicking as she ran the numbers. She owes the community $38,000 in fraudulent payments plus another $18,000 in interest and penalties. Add legal fees and damages for the harassment campaign, and we're looking at $65,000 minimum. Her house is worth maybe $420,000, so we can definitely collect through a property lien that could force a sale. The strategy crystallized like ice forming on a winter window. We'd file formal demand letters requiring full financial restitution and Margaret's immediate resignation. If she refused, we'd proceed with criminal referrals to the district attorney and civil litigation for damages. But the real knockout punch came from presenting this evidence to the entire community at the next association meeting. Public accountability is your nuclear option, Martinez told me, packing the documents into a briefcase that looked like it had seen plenty of courtroom victories. Margaret's been counting on resident apathy and ignorance to cover her tracks. Once everyone sees how much money she's personally stolen from their wallets, her kingdom collapses overnight. Walking to my car, the afternoon sun warming my face for the first time in weeks, I realized we'd just flipped the entire game board. Margaret thought she was fighting some troublemaker who didn't know his place. Instead, she'd been systematically creating evidence of her own crimes while attacking someone whose spouse taught him that bullies only understand one language: consequences. Tuesday evening, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, mapping out our battle plan like a general preparing for D-Day. The smell of Sophia's homemade lasagna drifted from the oven, mixing with the sharp scent of fresh printer ink as I organized 3 years of financial evidence into neat piles, each stack representing another nail in Margaret's coffin. But I knew from my years supervising maintenance crews that the best plans involved the right people in the right positions. Margaret was about to discover she'd been fighting the wrong war. First call went to Tom Garcia, my retired accountant neighbor, who'd been watching this drama unfold with growing disgust. "I've been waiting for someone to take her down," he said, when I explained what we found, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd finally found a worthy puzzle to solve. "Send me those financial records. I'll create a presentation that even my 95-year-old mother could understand." Tom spent 45 years following money trails for the IRS. If anyone could make Margaret's fraud crystal clear to angry homeowners, it was him. Sophia contributed her healthcare expertise, organizing our documentation with the systematic precision she used to track patient medications in the emergency room. She created a timeline showing how Margaret's harassment escalated alongside the fraudulent payments, each incident color-coded and cross-referenced like a medical chart tracking symptom progression. "In medicine, we call this pattern recognition," she explained, highlighting dates with a yellow marker that squeaked against the paper. "Show the pattern, and the diagnosis becomes obvious to everyone." Wednesday brought our first media ally, Sarah Chen, the local reporter who'd been covering municipal corruption for the Tribune. She arrived at our house with a tape recorder and the hungry expression of a bloodhound who'd caught a fresh scent. Association corruption is exploding statewide, she told us over coffee, her pen moving rapidly across her notepad like she was taking dictation from justice itself. Readers eat these David versus Goliath stories for breakfast, especially when there's juicy financial fraud involved. Sarah's investigation uncovered details we missed. Richardson Grounds LLC had no business license, no insurance, and no employees beyond Margaret's husband, Frank, who was listed as both owner and sole contractor. The company's bank account showed deposits that perfectly matched association payments, but virtually no business expenses, no equipment purchases, no material costs, no payroll taxes. It was a shell company designed purely to funnel community money into the Richardson family checking account. About as subtle as a neon sign advertising theft. Thursday evening brought Detective Jim Walsh to our dining room table, his off-duty presence lending the gravity of someone who'd seen real criminals operate. Walsh lived 3 streets over and had watched Margaret's antics with the bemused expression of someone who knew actual threats when he saw them. False police reports are typically misdemeanors, he explained, reviewing the timeline of Margaret's harassment campaign while the ice cubes clinked in his sweet tea. But when they're part of a systematic pattern designed to intimidate witnesses to financial crimes, that escalates everything to felony territory. Your spouse isn't just being harassed, she's being targeted to prevent exposure of the fraud. The technical preparation intensified throughout the week. Attorney Martinez drafted a cease and desist order that read like a legal death sentence, demanding Margaret stop all harassment and begin immediate financial restitution. We prepared formal complaints for the state attorney general's office, the county prosecutor, and the state insurance commission that regulates association operations. Each document built our case like layers of medieval armor, protecting us from any desperate legal counterattack Margaret might attempt. But the real breakthrough came Friday when Tom Garcia called with excitement, crackling in his voice like electricity before a storm. "You need to see this," he said, arriving 20 minutes later with a laptop and the triumphant expression of someone who'd just solved a murder mystery. His forensic accounting analysis revealed that Margaret's theft followed a predictable pattern. She stole the most money during months when association reserves were highest, timing her fraud to avoid triggering automatic audits that kicked in when accounts dropped below certain thresholds. "She's been gaming the system like a Vegas card counter," Tom explained, his spreadsheet showing payment cycles that coincided with seasonal assessments. Every spring, when annual dues come in, boom, massive landscaping emergency. Every fall, when special assessments are collected, suddenly we need urgent sprinkler repairs that cost exactly what's sitting in the bank. The sophistication suggested this wasn't amateur hour. Margaret had been running a deliberate, calculated fraud operation disguised as community improvement, probably learning the loopholes during her years working for the municipal planning department. Sophia suggested we invite every household personally, rather than relying on Margaret's official meeting notices. "She'll try to sabotage attendance," Sophia pointed out, remembering tactics from her hospital's contentious quality improvement meetings. "But if neighbors hear about this directly from us, curiosity will pack that room tighter than a Christmas morning living room." We spent Saturday afternoon going door to door, armed with copies of the most damning financial documents and Tom's simplified analysis that showed exactly how much each household had been overcharged. The response exceeded our wildest expectations. Mrs. Patterson invited us in for coffee that tasted like victory and revealed that Margaret tried to fine her $225 last year for having excessive garden decorations. 3. Ceramic frogs that her grandchildren gave her for Mother's Day. The Johnsons showed us a citation for their teenagers' basketball hoop being inappropriately visible from the street, as if teenagers playing basketball somehow threatened property values. By Sunday evening, we'd confirmed attendance from 32 of 35 households. Tom had created a PowerPoint presentation that would make corporate executives weep with envy. Sarah Chen had arranged for a photographer to document the meeting. Detective Walsh would attend in his personal capacity, but wearing his badge, a subtle reminder that criminal behavior has consequences that extend beyond association drama. Standing in our kitchen, surrounded by evidence, allies, and a plan more bulletproof than a bank vault, I realized we'd built something bigger than revenge. We'd created an army. Monday morning brought the first sign that Margaret knew the walls were closing in. Sophia found a business card tucked Under our windshield wiper, some cut-rate lawyer from 2 towns over advertising association, defense services in faded print that looked like it was copied on a 20-year-old machine. The card smelled faintly of desperation and cigarette smoke, probably slipped there by Frank Richardson in the pre-dawn darkness like some bargain basement spy thriller. But Margaret's real panic became obvious Tuesday when Tom Garcia called, chuckling like someone who'd just watched a clown fall into a wedding cake. She tried to hire my old accounting firm to represent her, he said, the amusement bubbling in his voice like champagne. Asked them to review irregularities in association financial oversight and prepare defenses against harassment by disgruntled residents. The partners took one look at the evidence Tom had already shared and politely declined, suggesting Margaret might want to contact a criminal defense attorney instead, preferably one who accepted payment plans. Wednesday evening, we discovered vandalism that crossed every line of civilized behavior. Sophia came home from her hospital shift to find our mailbox destroyed, not just damaged but completely obliterated with what looked like a baseball bat. Metal fragments scattered across our lawn like shrapnel from an explosion. Worse, someone spray-painted "liar" across our garage door in angry red letters that dripped down the white paint like accusations bleeding through fresh snow. Our security cameras captured everything, with the clarity of a nature documentary filming predator behavior. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m., and while the figure was wearing dark clothing and a hood, the gait and body shape matched Margaret perfectly. More damning, the person used our driveway to turn around, revealing a partial license plate that Sophia's sharp eyes matched to Margaret's silver sedan. Detective Walsh reviewed the footage and shook his head like someone watching a suspect confess on live television. Destroying mail receptacles is a federal crime, he explained, the evening breeze carrying the scent of neighbors' barbecue as we stood in our driveway surveying the damage. Add vandalism, trespassing, and intimidation of witnesses, and she's building herself quite the rap sheet. My sergeant always told us that criminals get stupid when they're scared. Looks like your association president is proving that theory. He filed the report immediately, noting that the vandalism occurred just days before our scheduled community confrontation. Timing that screamed deliberate witness. Intimidation Thursday brought psychological warfare disguised as community service. Margaret distributed flyers to every house claiming that certain residents were planning to destroy our peaceful community with false accusations and frivolous lawsuits. The flyer, printed on that same expensive cream-colored paper she used for official association business, warned neighbors about troublemakers who wanted to eliminate all community standards and turn our neighborhood into chaos. Reading it felt like watching someone dig their own grave with a gold-plated shovel. The flyer backfired more spectacularly than a 4th of July firework in a garage. Mrs. Patterson called it the most ridiculous thing she'd read since her grandson tried to convince her that professional wrestling was real. The Johnsons taped their copy to their front window with a handwritten note saying, "We support David and Sophia." By Friday afternoon, more than half the neighborhood had openly rejected Margaret's propaganda, some neighbors going so far as to march their flyers directly to our door, rolling their eyes at Margaret's obvious desperation. But Margaret wasn't finished with her campaign of terror. Friday brought the most disgusting escalation yet. Sophia's workplace got another anonymous call, this time claiming she'd been mentally compromised by neighborhood stress and should be evaluated for patient safety concerns. The caller provided specific details about Sophia's schedule and suggested the hospital monitor her behavior around patients. Using patient safety as a weapon against an emergency room, physician crossed lines that decent people don't even know exist. Sophia's supervisor, Dr. Rachel Morrison, called immediately, her voice tight with the kind of the national attention our story received opened floodgates I hadn't anticipated. My inbox became a digital tsunami of similar horror stories from across the country. Homeowners who'd been bullied, financially ruined and driven from their communities by corrupt HOA boards operating like suburban crime families. A retired teacher from Phoenix wrote about losing her home after being fined $47,000 for having the wrong shade of beige paint. A Marine veteran from North Carolina described being cited for displaying his Purple Heart flag improperly. A single mother from Texas explained how her children's medical equipment on their front porch had been deemed unsightly and resulted in lien proceedings. Each story followed eerily similar patterns. Selective enforcement targeting vulnerable residents, inflated fines designed to force compliance or foreclosure, and financial irregularities that would make forensic, Accountant Sweep, the documentary crew that had filmed our community transformation, was now producing a full-length feature called Suburban Tyranny, the hidden crisis of HOA abuse. They'd interviewed families from 17 states, uncovering what appeared to be a nationwide epidemic of corruption, hiding behind manicured lawns and community standards. Legal aid organizations started referring HOA abuse cases to me, recognizing that my combination of property management experience and community organizing success made me uniquely qualified to help residents fight back. The first case they sent involved a retirement community in Florida, where the board had been systematically targeting elderly residents with cognitive decline, manipulating them into signing documents that transferred ownership of their homes. The evidence was even more damning than Patricia's scheme. They'd hired a lawyer who specialized in elder exploitation, used fake medical evaluations to declare residents incompetent, and stolen over $2.3 million in property through legal manipulation that made Patricia's embezzlement look like pocket change. That case led to FBI raids on 17 Florida retirement communities and exposed what federal prosecutors called the largest elder financial abuse scheme in state history. The lead investigator credited our Colorado case with providing the template that helped them recognize the pattern. Maria's nonprofit, Community Justice Advocates, grew from a kitchen table operation to a legitimate organization with 6 full-time staff members and a budget approaching $400,000. They'd helped recover over $3.2 million for abused homeowners and successfully prosecuted 47 corrupt board members across 8 states. The legal precedents we'd established were being cited in courtrooms nationwide. Whitman vs. Maplewood Gardens became required reading in HOA law courses, and Catherine Reynolds, my original attorney, was now consulting on legislation in 12 states. The psychological impact of our victory extended far beyond financial recovery. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a community psychologist studying HOA abuse, explained that what we'd accomplished was rare in her field. A complete community transformation from learned helplessness to empowered collective action. Most abuse victims never recover their sense of agency, she told the documentary crew. What happened in Maplewood Gardens demonstrates that ordinary people can overcome systematic oppression when they have proper support and refuse to accept abuse as normal. Her research showed measurable improvements in community mental health, reduced anxiety and depression among elderly residents, improved social connections throughout the neighborhood, and increased civic engagement in local politics. The ripple effects reached the Colorado legislature, where our story had inspired comprehensive HOA reform legislation. Senator Catherine Wells, who'd sponsored the bill, invited me to testify during committee hearings. What Mr. Chen uncovered in his community represents failures at every level of oversight, she explained to the packed hearing room. When HOA boards can operate with less transparency than public utilities, abuse becomes inevitable. The resulting legislation was more comprehensive than we'd dared hope. Mandatory annual financial audits, criminal background checks for board members, whistleblower protections for residents reporting corruption, caps on fines and legal fees, and establishment of a state ombudsman office for HOA dispute resolution. Governor Richards signed the bill into law at a ceremony in Great Aunt Dorothy's Memorial Garden, calling it a model for protecting homeowner rights nationwide. The symbolism was perfect. Legislation protecting vulnerable residents signed in a garden honoring a woman who died, fighting for exactly that protection. But the most satisfying vindication came when the National Association of Realtors published new guidelines for HOA governance based directly on our case study. The organization that had enabled decades of abuse through willful ignorance was now recommending the exact transparency measures we'd fought to implement. The corporate world took notice too. Major employers started including HOA abuse protection clauses in relocation packages, recognizing that transferring employees to communities with corrupt boards created legal liability and employee retention problems. Insurance companies began requiring HOA board members to carry professional liability coverage, making corruption financially unviable for the first time in decades. When board positions carry personal financial risk, The power-hungry autocrats who dominated HOA governance for years suddenly lose interest. The transformation extended to HOA management companies, which historically had enabled corruption by looking the other way, when boards violated fiduciary duties. After several companies faced federal prosecution for facilitating financial crimes, the industry developed new ethical standards and reporting requirements. National media coverage reached its peak when 60 Minutes aired a segment titled The Homeowners Association Con Game, featuring our story as the centerpiece of their investigation into nationwide HOA corruption. The episode drew 14.3 million viewers and generated enough public outrage to prompt congressional hearings. Congressman Michael Torres, chairman of the House Subcommittee on Consumer Protection, announced plans for federal legislation establishing minimum transparency standards for HOA operations. When local crime syndicates can operate under the guise of community management, federal intervention becomes necessary to protect homeowner rights, he declared during opening remarks. The legal aftermath continued spreading like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Patricia's criminal conviction had invalidated every contract, fine and lien she'd imposed during her tenure, requiring the courts to sort through hundreds of disputed transactions. 23 families who'd been forced to sell their homes below market value filed civil suits seeking damages. The insurance company that had bonded the HOA was facing claims exceeding $4.8 million. Kevin's Landscaping business faced additional lawsuits from other communities, where his family connections had secured inflated contracts. The state attorney general's office established a dedicated HOA fraud investigation unit after discovering that our case represented just the tip of the iceberg. Their first year of operation resulted in criminal charges against 67 board members statewide and recovery of over $12 million in stolen community funds. Local law enforcement agencies started training officers to recognize HOA abuse patterns. Officer Martinez, who'd responded to Patricia's bogus complaints against me, became a regional expert on identifying and investigating HOA-related crimes. Most patrol officers saw these calls as civil disputes, he explained during a police training seminar. We didn't realize we were looking at organized financial crimes that required criminal investigation rather than mediation. The educational impact reached beyond law enforcement to social work, elder care, and legal aid organizations. Community colleges started offering courses in HOA governance and homeowner rights. Legal aid societies developed resource materials specifically addressing HOA abuse. Real estate professionals underwent massive education campaigns to help them identify and avoid communities with governance problems. The multiple listing service started requiring disclosure of ongoing HOA litigation, financial problems, and board governance issues. Property management companies overhauled their training programs, recognizing that ignorance was no longer a viable defense when employees enabled or overlooked financial crimes. Professional certification requirements now included ethics training and fraud detection. The psychiatric and psychological communities began studying HOA abuse as a distinct form of community-based trauma. Dr. Martinez's research showed that victims experienced symptoms similar to those seen in domestic violence situations: hypervigilance, social withdrawal, anxiety disorders, and depression. Support groups formed in communities across the country, providing safe spaces for HOA abuse victims to share experiences and develop coping strategies. The isolation that had enabled abusers like Patricia became much harder to maintain when victims had community support. Academic researchers in sociology, criminology, and public policy began studying our case as an example of successful grassroots organizing against institutional corruption. 3 doctoral dissertations were written analyzing the community organizing techniques we'd used. The international attention surprised everyone involved. Housing policy researchers from Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom studied our case as part of broader research into privatized community governance. Apparently, HOA-style corruption was a global problem, requiring international cooperation to address. 1 year after Patricia's sentencing, I was invited to speak at the International Conference on Community Governance in Toronto, addressing an audience of policymakers, researchers, and housing advocates from 14 countries. My presentation, From Victim to Victory: Transforming Communities. Through transparency and accountability, received a standing ovation, and led to consulting opportunities across North America. The personal transformation was equally dramatic. When I'd inherited Great Aunt Dorothy's house, I was unemployed, divorced, and essentially homeless. 18 months later, I was running a successful consulting business, had been featured in national media, and was consulting with government officials on policy reform. But the real measure of success wasn't professional recognition or financial recovery. It was the sound of children playing in yards without fear, elderly residents gardening without harassment, and neighbors talking to each other instead of hiding behind curtains. The smell of barbecue had indeed replaced the stench of fear, and the sound of laughter echoed where whispered complaints used to be the only neighborhood soundtrack. Chapter 16. The Counterattack. Just when I thought Patricia's story had reached its conclusion, her release from federal prison after serving 26 months of her 4-year sentence brought unexpected complications. Apparently, federal prison had not rehabilitated her understanding of personal responsibility or legal boundaries. Within 3 weeks of her release, Patricia had violated her parole conditions by attempting to contact former Maplewood Gardens residents through social media. Her Facebook messages ranged from pathetic attempts at reconciliation to barely veiled threats about settling scores with traitors who destroyed our community. The parole violation landed her back in federal custody for 6 months, but not before she'd managed to inspire a small group of enablers and conspiracy theorists who believed her version of events, that she'd been the victim of an elaborate frame-up orchestrated by outside agitators seeking to destroy traditional American communities. Her online supporters, primarily from other HOAs facing corruption investigations, created websites claiming that HOA reform movements were actually communist infiltration designed to undermine property rights and destroy suburban values. The theories were ridiculous, but they gained traction among people facing their own legal problems related to HOA governance. The conspiracy movement attracted attention from extremist groups who saw HOA corruption investigations as government overreach and federal tyranny. When 3 armed men showed up at my office claiming to be constitutional patriots investigating communist infiltration of property management, local law enforcement and FBI took the threat seriously. The security company I hired recommended relocating my business to a more secure location with professional monitoring systems. It felt surreal that fighting HOA corruption had somehow made me a target for domestic extremists. But apparently that's what America looked like in the social media age. Maria's nonprofit faced similar harassment. Their website was hacked multiple times. Staff members received threatening phone calls, and someone spray-painted communist traitors on their office building. The FBI's domestic terrorism unit opened an investigation after explosives were found in a package delivered to their office. The backlash revealed something disturbing about HOA corruption. It wasn't just financial crime. It was a manifestation of deeper authoritarian impulses that viewed any challenge to absolute authority as existential threat requiring violent response. Dr. Martinez's research into the psychology of HOA abuse had identified this pattern in other communities. Board members who abused their positions often attracted supporters who shared their belief that maintaining order justified any means, including financial crimes and intimidation. What we're seeing is classic authoritarian thinking, she explained during a security briefing with federal investigators. People who believe their authority is divinely ordained and that any challenge to that authority represents moral evil deserving punishment. The federal investigation into the harassment campaign uncovered financial connections between Patricia's supporters and several extremist organizations. The same dark money funding. Anti-government militias was apparently also funding efforts to protect corrupt HOA boards from accountability. The discovery led to expanded federal legislation addressing domestic terrorism connections to local corruption. The Community Safety and Accountability Act made it a federal crime to use threats, violence, or intimidation to prevent residents from exercising their legal rights within homeowner associations. Meanwhile, Patricia's legal problems continued multiplying. The IRS had discovered additional tax evasion related to unreported income from her HOA embezzlement schemes. State ethics investigators found evidence of real estate license violations going back 15 years. Multiple civil lawsuits were seeking damages for fraud, emotional distress, and violation of civil rights. Her bankruptcy filing was rejected after investigators discovered hidden assets, including cryptocurrency accounts and offshore financial instruments that suggested her crimes were more sophisticated than originally believed. The forensic accounting investigation expanded to include money laundering and potential connections to organized crime. The revelation that Patricia's corruption might be connected to larger criminal networks prompted federal prosecutors to offer reduced sentences to other convicted HOA board members who provided information about broader corruption schemes. The cooperation agreements led to investigations of HOA management companies in 17 states, uncovering what federal investigators described as systematized corruption involving hundreds of communities and millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions. The scope of the problem was staggering. Construction contractors paying kickbacks to board members, insurance companies inflating premiums and sharing profits with HOA officials, and legal firms billing communities for unnecessary litigation while sharing fees with board members who authorized the work. One management company in Nevada had been operating what amounted to a criminal enterprise. They would target communities with elderly residents, engineer board elections to install cooperative candidates, then systematically loot community funds while threatening residents who complained. The company's internal documents, obtained through federal search warrants, revealed a business model based explicitly on elder exploitation and financial abuse. They had protocols for identifying vulnerable communities, techniques for intimidating residents, and methods for hiding financial crimes from auditors. The federal investigation, now called Operation Suburban Justice, had become the largest investigation into community governance corruption in American history. Over 400 federal agents were involved in simultaneous raids across 23 states, resulting in 156 arrests and seizure of over $47 million in stolen community funds. The operation's success was attributed directly to the template we'd developed in Maplewood Gardens. Federal investigators credited our documentation methods, community organizing techniques, and legal strategies with providing the framework that made large-scale prosecution possible. Attorney General Sarah Williams announced the results at a press conference in Great Aunt Dorothy's Memorial Garden, explaining that ordinary citizens fighting extraordinary corruption created the roadmap for federal law enforcement to address what had become a nationwide crisis. Symbolism was powerful. The garden where an elderly woman had died fighting corruption had become the launching point for the largest federal investigation into community governance corruption in American history. But the most satisfying moment came when Patricia's supporters, who had spent months claiming she was the victim of government persecution, suddenly found themselves facing their own federal investigations. Several had been involved in their own HOA corruption schemes and had attacked our case to deflect attention from their own crimes. The conspiracy websites fell silent. The harassment stopped, and Patricia's enablers discovered that defending corruption was much easier when they weren't facing federal charges themselves. Patricia's final legal defeat came when the Supreme Court declined to hear her appeal, letting stand the lower court's decision that upheld her conviction and rejected her claims of government persecution. Her legal odyssey was finally over, along with any pretense that she'd been anything other than a criminal who had terrorized her community for personal profit. The aftermath of Operation Suburban Justice created lasting changes in how community governance was regulated and monitored. Federal oversight mechanisms, state ombudsman offices, and mandatory transparency requirements made it much harder for future Patricias to operate with impunity. But more importantly, residents across the country had learned that they had power when they organized, documented evidence, and refused to accept abuse as normal. The culture of intimidation that had enabled HOA corruption for decades was breaking down as communities discovered they could fight back successfully.